Hello coders, this is Jared with Renaissance Coders, and in this video we are going to cover moving, rotating, and scaling in Unreal Engine 4. Moving, scaling, and rotating objects in your level are tasks that you are going to do a lot, so it is definitely important to know the ins and outs of performing these actions in the Unreal Engine. We are only going to focus on these functionalities within the viewport and not the details panel. Okay, so the first thing that we are going to take a look at is the move tool. So what I'm going to do is just click on an object, and as you can see, we have these three arrows, one pointing straight forward, one to the right, and one pointing up. The x-axis is represented by the red arrow. The Y is represented by the green, and the Z is represented by the blue. To move an object, you can simply click on one of the arrows and drag. So I'm now moving the chair forward in the x-axis, and I can drag backwards and move it backwards in the x-axis. I can also do this with the Y and Z axes. Okay, another thing that you can actually do in the Unreal Engine is drag along two axes. And to do that, you simply have to click on this angle. So you see how these arrows are actually forming these 90-degree angles. And when I hover over that angle, the two axes light up yellow. All I have to do is click on that right angle and drag. And now you can see that I'm moving along those two axes at the same time. And you can do this with the Y and the Z, the Y and the X and the Z. Another way to move an object around in the scene is to click on the white ball in the center of all of the axes. So you can just click on this one and drag it around. And as you can see, this is more of a free-form movement. It's sort of snapping around and moving in just about every direction, so I can move it down. It's sort of based on your camera rotation, so if I move my camera around a little bit, then I'm moving more in the Z and the X, and then I can pull it down, it's going to go down, and then if I move over, so I'm facing a different direction, I can move it the Y and still the Z. So it's this type of movement is really going to be more based on how you're looking at the object. Now, one really important setting with moving an object is up here. So you can see we've got this open editor surface snapping options, we've got this grid that enables and disables snapping, and we've got this 10 here, and that sets the position grid snap value. So the first thing I'm going to do is open up this editor surface snapping value and turn on surface snapping. Okay, so now what this is going to do is I can actually move an object up off of the surface, click on this white ball, and then it's going to snap back down to the surface when I'm dragging the white ball around. You can still push objects through other objects, but anytime you click on this white ball and move, it's going to snap back to the surface, which is really powerful and extremely useful. The other thing you can do is actually disable the snapping. So if you disable snapping, the box will turn from orange to a more clear or white background, and with snapping disabled, you really enter a much more fluid movement, so you can move objects in very small increments with this option. So that's when you're tweaking an object and trying to get it in the exact right position, then you may want to turn off snapping. But I like to keep snapping on to just get the scene set up initially. So I'm going to turn snapping back on. And finally, the last thing you can do is increase or decrease the snap sizes. So you can go as high as 10,000 or as low as 1. If you go down to 1, this is sort of like moving with the free form. I mean, it's very small increments here, but it's always going to be snapping to a value of 1. Sometimes the value of 10 is a little high, so when you're in here and you're snapping around, you can see how it's sort of jumping around, and sometimes that's a little high for smaller scenes, so you can drop it down to 5 and see how that works out for you. You've still got a little bit of jumpiness to it. So really that's sort of your own preference, how you like to set the snap sizes. If you're working in a really large scene, then bumping it up to 10,000 may be good, but that's a very large number, so we'll actually bump it up and just see what happens. And actually I can't move it because it's actually too large for me to even move something, so my grid is just not that big. So I'm going to actually bump it back down to 10. If you ever get off of your movement tool, you can get back to it by pressing the W key. So the next thing we're going to focus on is rotation. So I'll press the E key to change my tool to the rotation key. But let's say I wanted to go back to the movement tool, then all I have to do is press the W key and it's back to moving. But let's go ahead and move on to rotation for now. And again, we've got rotation in the X, rotation in the Z, and rotation in the Y. And to rotate, you just click and then you can drag, and as you can see, we've still got a snapping value of 10 for this. And you can just sort of rotate any way you want. Let's say I wanted to turn my chair more inward here, and then I'm going to press W, maybe scoot it a little closer to the table. Just rotate a little bit more here. Okay. And then back to the rotation tool. So much like the move tool, the rotation tool also has some settings up here. It doesn't have as many settings as the move tool. So you can see we've got two settings up here. One enables or disables snapping. So if you disable snapping, then you're just moving it in really small increments, as you can see there. So instead of moving it in like increments of 10, we're moving it decimal points now. And if you ever move one and don't like the way you moved it, you can just press Command Z on Mac. I'm going to re-enable that because I do like to have the snapping on for rotation. And then you can also click here and either increase or decrease your rotation amount. So you can increase it to or decrease it to 5, and now we're going to move in increments of 5 instead of increments of 10. And you can also do this by divisions of 360 degrees. So let's just see what that does here. When I do this, you can see we've got a lot more points on our rotation here, so that gives us just like a finer control than even 5 degrees gives us, where you can even go up to 22.5 degrees. And again, you're just gonna, it's just breaking that up so you can do a few more rotational points. And I'm gonna go back to the move tool, move that guy out. Okay, so the final tool we're actually going to cover is the scaling tool in Unreal. And to scale or access the scaling tool, all you have to do is press the R key. And as you can see, we've got these 3 blocks that are attached to a center point that are the same color as our outline down here. So you can see, if you ever forget which axis is which, you can just look down here. And to scale, all you have to do, if you want to scale on a single axis, so we're going to scale on the x-axis here, you can just click and drag and you can scale up, or you can scale down. I'm going to scale it up a little bit. Actually, I didn't scale it up. There we go. And I'm going to scale it in the Y as well a little bit. And you can also scale in the Z if you want a really tall chair or a really short sofa or something like that. The great thing about having snapping turned on is that it's really easy to turn back to your initial values. So I'm just going to take it back down to what it was initially, which is 1 by 1 by 1, which is represented over here in the transform. Okay, if you also wanted to, let's say you just wanted to scale the entire object up at once, you can click on this white cube in the middle, click and drag, and this is going to increase it or decrease it along all of the axes at the same time. So you just want to make a really big chair, you could just, keep the proportions the same but scale it up. I'm actually going to undo that, scale it back down. The other thing with the scale tool is you can also scale along 2 axes, much like the move tool, so you can just hover on this line between the two, Click and drag, and this is going to increase along those two axes. So if you look over in the transform panel, or in the details panel at the transform component, you can see that I'm scaling in the Y and the Z, and you can do this for each of those axes combinations. It's a little hard to get to those right there. So, and like the move and rotation tools, we also have some settings for the scale tool. Of course, the first one is going to be enable or disable snapping. If you disable it, then you have a much finer control. So if you look at the transform tool, where you can see that we're increasing or decreasing in very small amounts here. Just going to set it back to the initial and turn snapping back on. Or you can increase or decrease the scaling snapping. And I like to have 0.25. That's a pretty good snapping value for scaling. I also like to have the snapping on for this because it's kind of rare that you would want to scale like 1/1000th of a decimal place. You know, it's not going to be much of a recognizable difference anyways. So I like to have snapping turned on for that. Sometimes the tool that I'll turn snapping on the most, or turn snapping off for the most, is the movement tool, and that's primarily just because sometimes you really want to get a very specific positioning. So if I turn that back off, I'm just going to get back. So I'm looking here, I'm going to rotate it back. So you can see here I can't get the same rotation as that other chair because my rotation snapping is too high. So let's see if I can do it with 1/10 of a degree. It's pretty close. And I'm just going to move it, try to get it back pretty close to where that other chair is at. Okay, that's not exactly where it was, but that's still pretty good positioning. And then once you're done with that, you can just turn snapping back on. Okay, the last thing that I wanted to talk about in this video is world space versus object space. And so as you can see right now, we've got this button here that says cycles the transform gizmo coordinate systems between world and local or object space. And so if I turn this on, it turns into a cube, and you can see that the arrows have changed directions a little bit. You know, they're sort of rotated around, and that's because right now this is the local space of this chair, and the local space is based on the pivot point of this chair. So if I turn it back off, you can see this is the world space. The world space is indicated by this gizmo down here, right? So world space is X going this way, Z is up, and Y is that way. But when I go to object space, now I can see that the pivot for this chair is pointing, the X is going this way, Y is this way, and Z is up. And I can move it along the object, in the object space, along the different axes if I wanted to. That's why grid snap or surface snapping is awesome. You can also rotate. And so as you can see, if I again turn off, if I transition from object to world space, you can see that the rotation is also based on the pivot of this object. So world, object, or local. And you can of course rotate on the local axis or local object space as well. Okay, one final note here, and this one's pretty interesting actually. When you change over to your scale tool, it automatically goes into object space. And that just sort of makes sense, right? Because you don't want to scale along the world settings, you want to scale with the object or scale along the object space. So, you know, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to have the X going this way, Y and Z going this way, because we want to scale this object specifically. You know, it's not like we're scaling the world here, we're just scaling this singular object. And that happens with every single object in here, you know. Even this floor cube here, if I click on it, I cannot exit object or local space. And that's the only tool that does that, right? So if you just cycle through, you will see that this button changes every time we go to scale. So that's all we have for this video. Be sure to drop us a like and subscribe if you learned anything new. And as always, thank you for watching.